Welcome to Mayo Clinic Q&A. I'm Dr. Helena Gazelka, and we thank you for joining us today. The concept of herd immunity has sparked debate about whether it might be helpful in controlling COVID-19. Herd immunity is a phenomenon that occurs when a sufficient number of a population has immunity to an infectious disease, such as a bacteria, or in this case, a virus, and it helps to control the spread from person to person, making it much less likely. Well, here with us today to answer our questions about this concept is Dr. Vincent Rajkumar. He's a hematologist and researcher and an expert on this topic at Mayo Clinic. Thanks for joining us today, Vincent.
Thank you so much, Helena, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it is wonderful. I love to learn something new every day, so I'm looking forward to this. I'm wondering if for our general population, community population, you would explain to us in simple terms what antibodies are and how they might make a difference in COVID-19.
Any of us, when we get an infection, one of the main mechanisms by which we fight infections is to make antibodies. Antibodies are made by cells in our blood called plasma cells. These live in lymphoid tissues, in the bone marrow, in the blood. They make antibodies and help us fight infection. Antibodies are simply proteins. They can be measured in the blood. And so when COVID-19 or the SARS coronavirus 2 infects us, we make antibodies against this virus, which helps us clear the virus.
Vincent, could you tell us what T cells are and how they play a part in COVID-19?
Fascinating thing about the human body is that we don't have just antibodies to fight an infection. We also have another immune process called T cell mediated immunity that also helps us fight infection. In antibody mediated immunity, we have cells that make proteins that target the virus. In cell mediated immunity, the actual cell itself fights the virus. So we have cells called T lymphocytes or T cells, and these can target the virus or bacteria or any other offending pathogen and affect it and kill it. Now, cell-mediated immunity and antibody-mediated immunity work hand in hand. They help each other out. And we need robust cell-mediated immunity as well as antibody-mediated immunity in order to fight an infection effectively.
Would it be safe to say then that herd immunity can happen in two different ways? One, by enough people catching the virus and becoming immune to it, and the other by us receiving a vaccine that would make us immune or unable to catch the virus?
That is correct. I mean, you can achieve herd immunity, which is when a sufficient proportion of the population is immune so that the virus has no place to go and the whole population becomes immune. Usually you need about 70% of the population to be immune to achieve what we call herd immunity so that the virus transmission drops dramatically. Now, this can be achieved partly by a proportion of the population getting the actual infection and partly by a proportion of the population that is vaccinated and has therefore achieved immunity as a result of the vaccine.
Is it possible to be immune without ever catching COVID-19 or knowing that you had it?
I think one of the main reasons why COVID-19 is a pandemic right now is because a lot of people who are spreading COVID-19 don't even have symptoms. So with the original SARS, people got very, very sick. So you could avoid them and they could avoid you. So transmission was cut short. With COVID-19, the reason it's a pandemic now and the whole world is suffering is because up to 80% of the people who get COVID-19 may not have any symptoms. So they are out there spreading, but they don't themselves have symptoms. Well, if you don't have symptoms, when you are immune, eventually you won't know about it. So yes, they are asymptomatic and eventually they become immune, but we don't know about them.
One thing I've been incredibly impressed with during this pandemic is the incredible speed with which we are sharing information, the number of articles that I've seen come out in journals, and the information in the newspaper and the sharing that's going on between institutions and even countries is remarkable. Have we learned anything from countries that were hit heavy earlier on with COVID-19 about herd immunity and how it's affected their populations, or is it too early for that?
We have learned a lot, and in fact, I'm very fascinated about this. The virus doesn't know geography. The virus doesn't know borders between states or countries, and it just goes to a place and attacks it. What have we learned? One thing we've learned is if you look at a place like Wuhan, where the virus actually started, you have almost 100,000 people got infections in Wuhan. But Wuhan has a population of 11 million. So what happened to the remaining 10.9 million people? When they've done seroprevalence studies in Wuhan, they found only about 3 to 4% of the population has had exposure to the virus. Does it mean the remaining 97% are really susceptible, or is a larger proportion of the population immune through some other mechanisms? We don't know. But then when we come to places like Madrid, like Milan, like Lombardy, like New York, or even Sweden, you get, when they've done seroprevalence studies, you get about 10 to 20% of the population who have antibodies against the virus. But then when you look at these hotspots, they've all kind of tanked and they've come down dramatically. Even though we think you need 70% of the population to be immune to have herd immunity, these kind of rapid decreases in these hotspots have happened even when only 10 to 20% of the population has antibodies. So what does this mean? One, it might mean that many of these places immediately started wearing masks, immediately started social distancing, they had some precautions instituted, and that's why things have come down. And if that's the case, you have to keep continuing to do that. And I really recommend we continue to do that. It's also possible that the seroprevalence is underestimating how many people are truly immune. Maybe more people are immune, but our antibody studies are not quite sensitive in capturing that.
So I guess a logical question, next question would be, how long does immunity to COVID-19 last? And does it differ if you've been exposed and have antibodies versus if we may get an immunization?
One of the reasons why people are concerned now is that some studies are coming out showing that antibody levels decrease with time rapidly after COVID-19. And the question is, if antibodies after a real infection go down, are these patients going to get COVID again? And if this is the case for real infections, what will happen with the vaccine? Would the antibodies just rapidly disappear so that the vaccines won't be effective at all? Now that's, I think, more of a theoretical concern. Generally, I view antibodies as simply biomarkers of whether somebody has had exposure or not. The cells that make these antibodies are there in the body. They are memory cells, they are long-lived plasma cells, and they will show up and fight an infection if and when the same pathogen comes back again, or in a vaccinated patient if they are exposed to COVID-19. So I'm not as concerned about the durability of the immunity or whether people can get it again. I think it's very likely that the infection is protective from a subsequent infection. It's very likely then the vaccine will also be protective. And these kind of decreases that we are seeing are mainly because a lot of patients with COVID are asymptomatic. So they've actually seen that most of these decreases happen in people who've got asymptomatic infections. In 40% of those patients, the antibodies even completely disappear. But it doesn't mean that they are now suddenly susceptible again. Um, the odds are very high that they still have the cells that made them long-lived in the body, and that if they ever meet COVID again, they would be able to handle it. So I'm very optimistic. I'm much more optimistic than what the reports have been coming out. Then we also cannot forget, like we talked about, T-cell immunity. We have many studies now showing that people have robust T-cell responses against this virus, even if they don't have antibodies. And these T cells are going to immediately recognize the virus and also afford protection. And we have data like uh, uh, interesting data, for example, from Sweden, where if you look at close family contacts, some people you can detect antibodies. but in twice as many people, you could detect T cells that are targeting the COVID virus. So there are other mechanisms, and they didn't get symptoms. So this is very fascinating. In the Antarctica cruise ship, you had 10 rooms with 2 people in a room, so that's 20 people. One had COVID, one didn't. I mean, if you spend 20 days in the same room and you don't get COVID, there must be some other mechanism by which you're getting immunity. So there's many, many examples like this that I can give you to suggest that antibodies are one thing, T cells are a second weapon against this virus. And no matter what happens to these levels, whether it's through natural infection or a vaccine, there will be protection for us. Protection not maybe from a trivial infection, but certainly from a serious infection. That's all we want. We don't want people to get very sick. And to that extent, these things will help.
Early on, during the course of this COVID pandemic, I remember hearing people kind of argue that why don't we just let everybody get the virus and get it over with? Second to that was, well, we don't have enough ventilators in the United States, perhaps, to support that idea. So we need to kind of slow things down by social distancing and masking. But now it would seem that that is more, the reason we are doing those things is almost more to slow the spread before we have a vaccine. Would that be a true estimation?
You achieve a lot by slowing the spread. We have learned in the last few months how to deal with very sick patients. Just at Mayo Clinic, proning, oxygen, the use of dexamethasone, the use of remdesivir, you reduce the mortality significantly. Um, by slowing the spread with masks, with social distancing, I also believe you reduce the viral dose. So if you look at healthcare workers in highly affected hotspots, they had high risk of dying, probably because they were exposed to very high viral loads. Now with masks, social distancing, and this whole strategy of let's stretch it out, a second benefit is if you do get exposed, you probably are going to get a lower viral dose, and hopefully that means a milder infection. And what's not to think about that a vaccine is in sight. So if we can spread it out another 6 months, hopefully we can get vaccine for the vulnerable people, vaccines for the people who are working in healthcare facilities, and really save a huge number of lives. So I think we need to continue to go on the same track. We don't need complete lockdowns, but very cleverly try to keep the country going, and at the same time flatten the curve, so to speak, so that we can save more lives and prevent too many people from getting sick at the same time, overwhelming the healthcare system.
That's a really great reminder of our personal responsibility in all of this. It's not just one person, it's all of us.
Exactly, exactly.
It's interesting. Okay, so my last question for you, Vincent, is
Yes.
one of particular interest to me, because I have read that people with type A blood may be more susceptible to developing COVID-19, and I happen to have type A blood. I'm curious if blood type or male versus female sex have something to do with the development of COVID-19 and how much it will affect you.
Oh, this is a very interesting question because you have one advantage in the sense that um, by being of the female gender, I have one advantage. I am O positive. So, there's some trade-off there. Because what studies show now is that and there are many studies. One was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. I think one was published as a preprint. Both studies show the same thing, that people with O blood group have about probably a third less chance of getting COVID-19 than rest of the blood groups. And people with A have about a 25% extra chance of getting COVID-19 compared to other blood groups. Why this is still not clear. There might be some cross-reactivity, maybe the antibodies that a patient with O, that a person with O blood group might have against the A antigen may somewhat interfere with the COVID-19 virus. But there are studies now suggesting that, and so we have to keep that in mind. But the risk reduction by 20% or 30% extra is very minor. So I don't think people with A group need to be that worried or anything. I think it's more of a trivia than a real effect on humans with thing. The other thing that's more fascinating is the gender difference. So many studies show males have a more serious illness than females. And there's a fascinating study in JAMA, I think, uh, that looked at two sets of twins, identical twins, four brothers uh, from the Netherlands, uh, treated at different hospitals. One set of twins got very, very sick, and all of them are young, less than 35 years old. You wouldn't think that they will get sick, but one set of twins got very sick. One brother died, one survived. And then a month later, another set of twins, similarly, both young, both got very critically ill. And so a lot of studies were done to see why would this be happening in young men like this. And they did a whole genome sequencing, and they found that both of them had mutations in TLR7, which is the toll-like receptor 7, which the protein helps you mount an immune response. And they had mutations in this, and that is located on the X chromosome. So the thinking is that one of the reasons that men may have a more severe disease is that they may have mutations in this TLR7, which is sitting on chromosome X. So they don't have another copy of X chromosome to counter that. Whereas women with two X chromosomes may be able to overcome that, even if they have mutations in one. So I don't know. It's fascinating.
It is really fascinating. Like I said, there's just so much, there's new information every day. It's really interesting and a little bit difficult to keep up with, in fact.
Exactly, exactly.
Thank you so much to Dr. Vincent Rajkumar, a hematologist and researcher here at the Mayo Clinic, for joining us today to tell us about herd immunity. Thanks to you too for watching Mayo Clinic Q&A and for learning something new with me today. Have a wonderful day.
Mayo Clinic Q&A is a production of the Mayo Clinic News Network and is available wherever you get and subscribe to your favorite podcasts. To see a list of all Mayo Clinic podcasts, visit newsnetwork.mayoclinic.org. Then click on Podcasts. Thanks for listening, and be well. We hope you'll offer a review of this and other episodes when the option is available. Comments and questions can also be sent to Mayo Clinic News Network at mayo.edu.